Hey, he's Kian.
And she's Em.
And together we're the hosts of Do You Dare? So, Do You Dare is our podcast where we discuss all things true crime,
all things paranormal,
and all things history, mystery, and beyond.
Plus, don't forget the aliens.
Oh, that's silly of me. How could I forget those?
We're just two British siblings with mics, hoping to bring some spooky, some twisted, and some downright sinister to your ears.
If you like what you're listening to right now, type in Do You Dare into wherever you get your podcasts and join us as we delve into all things dark and spine-tingling with our customary British flair.
Come join the dark side, if you dare.
Power is often measured in crowns, coins, and conquest. But what if it hums in the hush between drumbeats, or lingers in the scent of jasmine and smoke? What if magic isn't illusion, but inheritance, passed down through whispers, rituals, and resistance? And what if the most potent force in history has always been the woman who refuses to be defined, dismissed, or destroyed?
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
History likes its heroines quiet. It prefers its witches burned, its rebels forgotten, and its magic explained away. But some names refuse to be erased. They echo in alleyways and rituals, in songs and secrets. They rise from the grave not to haunt, but to remind. That belief is a kind of rebellion, that mystery is a kind of truth, and that the feminine is not fragile, but feral. She was called many things: healer, sorceress, saint, seductress. But none of them quite capture her essence. Today we speak of her name not to summon fear, but to summon awe. Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, on St. Anne Street near Rampart, once stood a modest Creole cottage that belonged to Marie Laveau. Built in the early 19th century, the house was typical of its time and region. Single-story, wood-framed, with a steeply pitched roof and asymmetrical facade. The interior was painted in mute tones, often whitewashed with green shutters that would be closed tightly against storms or prying eyes. A narrow front porch ran along the entrance, shaded by the overhanging of the roof and supported by simple columns. Inside, the layout followed a shotgun-style common to New Orleans homes. Rooms arranged in a straight line from front to back with no hallways. The front room served as a parlor where visitors were received. Behind it were the living quarters, a kitchen, and a small rear garden. The furnishings were modest but well kept. Wooden chairs, a table, a few religious icons, and personal items that hinted at both Catholic devotion and African spiritual traditions. The scent of herbs and oils often lingered in the air, and it was said that candles burned at all hours, illuminating altars tucked into corners. The cottage was not grand, but it was known. Locals passed by with reverence and curiosity. Visitors came for many reasons. Some sought healing. Others came with questions they couldn't ask in church or courtrooms. A few arrived out of desperation, clutching scraps of cloth or locks of hair, hoping for intervention. They came from all walks of life: Creole, aristocrats, enslaved laborers, merchants, soldiers, and women with secrets. The cottage was not grand, but it was known. Locals passed by with reverence and curiosity. Visitors came for many reasons. Some sought healing, others came with questions they couldn't ask in church or courtrooms. A few arrived out of desperation, clutching scraps of clothing or locks of hair, hoping for intervention. And they came from all walks of life: Creole aristocrats, enslaved laborers, merchants, soldiers, and women with secrets. The cottage was never advertised, but its reputation traveled by word of mouth, passed in markets and whispered in alleyways and carried on the breath of rumor. Some claimed to hear chants from within. Others swore they saw people enter and never return the same. It was a place of healing, of ritual, of unintrusive power. Those who enter it described it as a stillness inside, as if the air was suspended and the house was listening. The walls lined the shelves, holding jars, bones, feathers, and folded cloth. There were crucifixes and saints, and the scent of camphor and rosewater would waft through the air. And though it stood for decades, today there is no trace of it. The lot is empty, paved over, and absorbed by the changing landscape of the city. Tourists walk past without knowing what once stood there. The walls are gone, the garden erased, and the porch forgotten. Only the address remains, whispered in guidebooks and ghost tours. Marie Laveau was born in New Orleans in 1801. Her birth name was Marie Catherine Laveau. She was a free woman of color, born into a society where racial categories were rigid but not absolute. Her mother, Marguerite Torquentel, was also a free woman of color, and her father is believed to have been Charles Laveau, a white man of French descent. Marie grew up in a city where French and Spanish colonial legacies shaped daily life, and where Catholicism was deeply embedded in both private and public rituals. She was raised in Creole tradition, likely bilingual in French and English, and baptized into the Catholic Church at St. Louis Cathedral. Her early years were spent in a community of free people of color who lived in a tenacious space, neither enslaved nor fully accepted by white society. Education for girls in her social class was limited, but oral tradition, religious instruction, and domestic skills were emphasized. She would have learned prayers, herbal remedies, and the customs of both the Catholic and African-rooted spiritual practices from women in her family and neighborhood. In early 19th century New Orleans, society was layered and volatile, a city defined by its collisions of empire, race, and ritual. French and Spanish colonial legacies lingered in architecture and law, while African and Caribbean traditions pulsed beneath the surface. The city was a port of trade and tension, where enslaved labor fueled prosperity, and yet Black communities carved out space for autonomy. Creoles of color occupied a unique social tier. They were educated, property-owning, and Catholic, yet never fully shielded from racial prejudice. Slavery was entrenched, but resistance, spiritually, culturally, and personally, was consistent. Women of color in particular navigated a world that sought to confine them, yet some found influence in roles that straddled the sacred and the practical. Midwives, healers, and spiritual guides held quite authority in their communities. Catholicism dominated public life, but African-rooted practices thrived in private homes, creating a spiritual landscape that was layered and fluid. The French Quarter was dense with life, markets crowded with goods and gossip, music drifting from courtyards, and rituals unfolding behind shuttered windows. It was a city of masks and codes, where appearances mattered, but what happened behind closed doors mattered more. This was the world Marie Laveau grew up in. Her childhood was shaped not only by her family, but by the city itself, a place of contradiction and convergence. She lived among people who understood both survival and ceremony, who knew how to move between systems and traditions. The rhythms of New Orleans, the chants, the commerce, the quiet acts of defiance, were a part of her earliest education. Long before she was called queen, she was simply a girl in a city that taught her how power could be hidden, how magic could be real, and how women could shape history from the margins. In 1918, Marie Laveau married Jacques Paris, a free black man who had immigrated from Saint-Domingue, a French colony that would later become Haiti. His arrival in New Orleans was part of a larger migration following the Haitian Revolution, which had displaced many free people of color. Jacques was a cabinet maker by trade, and their marriage was recorded at St. Louis Cathedral, consistent with the Catholic customs of the time. The couple lived together in the French Quarter, likely in modest accommodations. Records suggest that their life together was brief. Within a few years, Jacques Paris disappeared from the official documents. Some sources listed him as deceased, while others suggested he may have abandoned the marriage. The exact circumstances remain unclear. By 1822, Marie was listed in the city records as the Widow Paris, a title she would carry for the rest of her life. During this period, Marie began working as a hairdresser. Her clientele included wealthy white women, Creole families, and members of the New Orleans elite. The position gave her access to private homes and personal conversations, placing her in a unique social role. She was known for discretion, skill, and a calm presence. Her work allowed her to move between social classes and gather information, which would later contribute to her reputation. Her first marriage marked a turning point. As a widow, she gained a degree of independence uncommon for women of her time. She supported herself through trade and began establishing relationships that extended beyond her immediate community. Though little is known about her emotional life during these times, the historical record shows a woman who adapted quickly to change and began to build a foundation for the influence she would later yield. Hairdressing in this era was more than a cosmetic service. It was personal and often a private interaction. Marie entered homes and spent hours with her clients and listened. She became known not only for her skill for hair, but her discretion. Her clientele trusted her. They spoke freely in her presence, sharing details about their families, finances, and social affairs. Marie was observant and intelligent. She listened carefully and remembered what she heard. Over time, she developed a network of information that extended across class and racial lines. Her position gave her access to both the elite and the working class, and she moved between these worlds with ease. Hairdressing also provided financial stability. Marie was able to support herself and her children, and she maintained a level of independence that was rare for women of color at the time. She was not reliant on charity or domestic labor. Her work was respected, and her reputation grew steadily. Clients recommended her to others, and her name became known in households across the city. It is this foundation that would later support her rise as a spiritual leader. But in these early years, she was simply a skilled professional with access to the private lives of New Orleans' most influential residents. By the early 1820s, Marie Laveau was known in her community as the Widow Paris. She had established herself as a hairdresser and was supporting herself through her trade. Around this time, she entered into a domestic partnership with Christophe Glaplin, a white man of French descent. Glaplin came from a family with military ties and social standings in New Orleans. The relationship was not formalized through marriage, as interracial unions were prohibited by law, but they lived together as husband and wife for over 3 decades. Christophe moved into Marie's household, and together they raised several children. Records show that Marie used the name Marie Glaplin in some legal documents, and Christophe was listed as a resident in their home. Their household was located in the French Quarter, and it remained their resident until his death in 1855. The relationship provided stability, and Christophe's presence in the house was accepted by the community, though not publicly acknowledged in elite circles. Their partnership was notable for its longevity and discretion. Christophe did not appear frequently in public records beyond property and census documentation, and there is little evidence of his involvement in Marie's professional and spiritual work. However, his presence in her life coincided with her growing influence in New Orleans. The household they built together became a center of activity, and Marie's reputation continued to expand during these years. By the 1830s, Marie Laveau's name was known beyond her neighborhood. Her work as a hairdresser had placed her in close contact with influential families, and her reputation for discretion and insight had grown steadily. Around this time, she began to be recognized not only as a skilled professional, but as someone with spiritual knowledge. Clients and neighbors began seeking her out for more than hair care. They came with personal concerns, illness, and requests for guidance. Marie's spiritual practice drew from multiple traditions. She was a devout Catholic and regularly attended Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, and she incorporated Catholic saints, prayers, and rituals into her work. At the same time, she practiced elements of voodoo, a spiritual system rooted in West African beliefs and shaped by Caribbean and Creole influences. Her ability to blend these traditions made her accessible to a wide range of people in New Orleans, from devout Catholics to those familiar with African spiritual customs. She had begun conducting rituals, offering remedies, and preparing charms. Some of her work took place in private homes, while other ceremonies were held in public spaces, including Congo Square, a gathering place for free and enslaved Black residents. Marie was not the only voodoo practitioner in the city, but she quickly became the most prominent. Her reputation was built on results, and people spoke of her with respect and caution. By the mid-1930s, she was widely regarded as a spiritual leader. Her name appeared in newspapers, often with a mix of curiosity and fear. Some accounts describe her as a healer, others as a sorceress. The details varied, but the recognition was consistent. Marie Laveau had moved from a private consultant to public influence, and her role in New Orleans society had shifted. She was no longer just a hairdresser or a widow. She was becoming the voodoo queen. Voodoo and hoodoo are often confused, but they are distinct traditions with different structures and purposes. Voodoo is a religion with formal rituals and pantheons of spirits and priesthood. It originated from Fawn and Ewe people of West Africa. It was brought over to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. In Louisiana, voodoo evolved through a blending of African spiritual systems, Catholicism, and local indigenous practices. It included a belief in a supreme creator, honor of the spirits known as Laos, and use of altars, offerings, and ceremonies. Catholic saints were often used as a symbolic stand-ins for African spirits, allowing enslaved people to preserve their beliefs under colonial scrutiny. Hoodoo, by contrast, is not a religion, but a system of folk magic. It developed among African Americans in the southern United States, particularly in Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast. Hoodoo emerged from African spiritual practices, but was shaped by the realities of slavery and survival. It incorporated Native American herbal knowledge, European folk magic, and Christian symbolism. Practitioners, often called root workers or conjure doctors, used herbs, charms, and rituals to address everyday concerns like health, protection, love, and justice. In New Orleans during the 19th century, both voodoo and hoodoo played important roles in the lives of Black residents, both free and enslaved. These practices offered spiritual guidance, cultural continuity, and a form of resistance against opposition. Public spaces, like Congo Square, became a gathering point for rituals and community. Despite laws like the Code Noir, which prohibited African religious practices, these traditions persisted, often in private homes or disguised with Catholic rituals. Marie Laveau's work drew primarily from voodoo, but she also employed elements from hoodoo in her practice. Her ability to blend religious devotions with folk magic made her accessible to a wide range of people. For many in her community, these traditions were not separate. They were part of a shared spiritual landscape that helped people navigate a society built on inequality and control. Marie Laveau's public ceremonies were among the most visible expressions of voodoo in New Orleans during the 19th century. While much of her spiritual work took place in private settings, she also led rituals in public spaces, most notably Congo Square and along the banks of Lake Pontchartrain. These gatherings were held on Sundays and feast days, often coinciding with Catholic observations, which allowed participants to blend religious traditions without drawing unwanted attention from authorities. Congo Square, located just outside of the French Quarter, was a designated gathering place for enslaved and free Black residents. On Sundays, when enslaved people were permitted to rest, the square was filled with music, dancing, and spiritual activity. Marie was known to appear at these gatherings, sometimes leading rituals, other times observing. Her presence drew attention, and over time, she became a central figure in ceremonies. Participants formed circles and sang in call and response patterns to invoke spirits through formal drumming and movement. Offerings were made, food, coins, candles, and symbolic items were placed on altars or in the earth. At Lake Pontchartrain, ceremonies were more secluded. These gatherings often held at night and involved smaller groups. Witnesses described bonfires, chanting, and ritual dances. Marie was said to lead prayers, direct offerings, and guide participants through spiritual petitions. The lake's edge provided a natural boundary, and the water itself held symbolic meanings in many African traditions. These ceremonies were not theatrical performances. They were religious events, conducted with seriousness and purpose. The public nature of these rituals drew attention from newspapers, city officials, and curious onlookers. Reports varied in tone. Some described the ceremonies as exotic or threatening, others as cultural gatherings. Marie's leadership was consistently noted. She maintained order, ensured respect for the ritual, and controlled access to certain parts of the ceremonies. Her ability to manage both the spiritual and social aspects of these events contributed to her reputation as a powerful and respected figure. Every year, on the eve of June 24th, the shores of Lake Pontchartrain shimmered with firelight and echoed with drums. It was St. John's Eve, a sacred night when the veil between the worlds thinned, and at the center of it all stood Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans. St. John's Eve was no ordinary celebration. Rooted in Catholic traditions, it honored John the Baptist, but in New Orleans it became something more. For the city's voodoo practitioners, it was a night of power, purification, and connection. Marie Laveau began leading these ceremonies in the 1830s or 1840s, transforming them into public rituals that blended African spirituality, Catholic symbolism, and Creole culture. This event included cackling bonfires, drums pulsing like heartbeats, dancers moving in rhythm under the moonlight. Marie, dressed in flowing white, carried a staff, sometimes a snake, a symbol of the spirit, Dambala. Offerings were laid at altars, prayers were spoken in Creole and African tongues, and the lake itself became a sacred mirror for the spirits. To her followers, it was holy. To outsiders, it was mysterious, sometimes feared, often misunderstood. Journalists described the ceremonies with a mix of awe and sensationalism. But Marie held her ground. She kept the rituals dignified, controlled the crowd, and ensured that voodoo was seen not as superstitious, but as a spiritual truth. A woman once came to Marie Laveau's home in St. Anne Street, carrying a child in her arms. The boy was feverish, his breathing shallow, and the mother had already tried everything she could afford. She had visited the local doctor, prayed at St. Louis Cathedral, and consulted neighbors. Nothing had worked. Someone told her to go to Marie. Marie welcomed her inside without asking questions. The house was quiet, the air filled with the scent of herbs and candle smoke. Marie examined the child and then moved to a shelf where she kept jars of dried plants and oils. She prepared a poultice using crushed leaves, warm water, and a small amount of oil. She applied it to the boy's chest and whispered a prayer in Creole, and then, her voice low and steady. The mother sat nearby and watched, not speaking. Marie lit a candle and placed it near the child. She sprinkled a powder around the base and continued her prayer. After a few minutes, she told the mother to keep the poultice on overnight and return in the morning. The woman left quickly, carrying her son wrapped in a blanket. The next morning, she returned with a basket of offerings, fruit, coins, and a small bottle of rum. The boy was awake, alert, and no longer feverish. The mother thanked Marie, who accepted the gifts without ceremony, and told her to keep the child away from the cold air for the rest of the week. In another case, a man was facing trial for theft. His family believed that he had been wrongly accused, but they had no money for a lawyer and no influence in the courts. They came to Marie, and she listened to their story, then visited the jail where the man was being held. She spoke with him, prayed with him, and left behind a small pouch tied with a red string. In the days that followed, the tone of the trial shifted. Witnesses hesitated, the prosecution lost momentum, and the judge grew impatient. The man was released with minimal penalty. His family returned to Marie with offerings and thanks. No one could explain what had happened, but those who knew her believed it was not the first time she had intervened in such matters. Reporters began to take notice of Marie Laveau, not just as a practitioner of voodoo, but as a public figure. In the early years, articles describe her ceremonies with curiosity, sometimes skepticism. Writers from the northern newspapers visiting New Orleans would attend her rituals at Congo Square or hear stories from locals, then publish accounts with a mix of observation with rumor. They often emphasized the exotic nature of her work, portraying her as a mysterious woman with unusual power. The local papers were more considerate. They noted her presence at public events, her role in healing, and her influence among the free people of color and white residents. Some editors referred to her as a queen, a title that began to appear more frequently in print. It was not an official designation, but it stuck. And over time, Voodoo Queen became a shorthand for her identity, even though her work extended far beyond ritual practice. As her reputation grew, so did the tone of the coverage. Stories began to highlight her acts of charity. She was seen visiting the sick, helping the poor, and offering comfort to prisoners. Journalists wrote of her calm demeanor, her ability to command attention without raising her voice, and her knowledge of herbs and remedies. She was described as a woman of dignity and respected across social lines. There were some articles that hinted at her political connections. They noted that she could speak with city officials, that her presence in certain cases seemed to influence outcomes. These mentions were brief and never confirmed, but they added to her mystique. Readers began to see her not just as a spiritual leader, but as a woman with real power in the city. By the mid-century, the press referred to her as the Benevolent Queen. The title reflected both admiration and caution. She was known to help, but she was never to be crossed. Her name carried weight, and her reputation was shaped as much by what was written as by what was left unsaid. Marie Laveau was often seen with a snake during her public ceremonies, particularly those held on St. John's Eve. The snake was known as Grand Zombie, and it held symbolic importance within her spiritual practices. In Louisiana voodoo, Grand Zombie was not a pet, but a representation of powerful spirit. The name is derived from African traditions, where the serpent is associated with creation, wisdom, and the divine. In some belief systems, Grand Zombie is linked to the spirit Dambala, a major Lao who governs life and is often symbolized by a snake. Witnesses describe Marie carrying the snake with confidence and care. It was said to be large, possibly a boa constrictor, and she would sometimes wrap it around her shoulders during rituals. The presence of Grand Zombie added a visual element to the ceremonies that reinforced her authority. Participants viewed the snake not with fear but with reverence. It was a part of the ritual, part of the invocation, and part of the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. The snake also served a practical purpose. It distinguished Marie from other practitioners and created a memorable image that stayed with observers. Journalists who attended the ceremonies often mentioned the snake in their reports, sometimes exaggerating its role, but consistently noting its presence. For Marie's followers, Grand Zombie was a familiar figure, a symbol of power and protection. For outsiders, it was a sign that something different was happening, something they didn't fully understand. Marie's handling of Grand Zombie was deliberate. She used the snake to signal the beginning of certain rituals and to mark transitions within the ceremony. It was not for display, for spectacle, but for spiritual function. The snake's movements were slow and controlled, and Marie's interaction with it was calm and purposeful. Those who attended the ceremonies understood that Grand Zombie was not separate from the ritual. It was part of the ritual itself. As Marie Laveau aged and began to withdraw from public ceremonies, another figure began to take her place. This younger woman, also named Marie, bore a striking resemblance to her mother, not just in appearance, but in bearing. She was tall, commanding, and carried herself with the same quiet confidence that had defined her mother's presence at Congo Square and the banks of the bayou. The people began to see her leading rituals, accepting offerings, and invoking the spirits with the same cadence and authority that Marie Laveau had used for decades. This daughter, Marie Laveau II as she became known, was not simply imitating her mother. She had grown up immersed in the practice, watching the ceremonies unfold year after year. She learned the songs, the symbols, the timing. She knew which spirits to call and how to call them. Her transition into leadership was not abrupt. It was graceful, gradual, almost seamless. By the time her mother had fully stepped back from public life, the younger Marie had already been recognized as a spiritual figure in her own right. Another daughter, Philomena, meanwhile, remained involved but in a quieter capacity. She helped maintain the household, keep track of family affairs, and occasionally assisted with the rituals, but she did not seek the spotlight. She was respected, especially among those who knew the family personally, but she did not become the public face of voodoo in New Orleans. That role belonged to her sister. The community responded with a mix of devotion and interest. Some believed that Marie Laveau had never truly stepped away, that she had simply changed her appearance or returned in another form. The resemblance between mother and daughter fueled rumors that the original Marie Laveau had become immortal, or that she possessed her daughter's body. Others understood the truth, that the younger Marie had inherited not just her mother's name, but her calling. From on, Marie Laveau II continued to lead ceremonies, often with the same snake, Grand Zombie, wrapped around her shoulders. She maintained the traditions, honored the spirits, and kept her mother's legacy alive. Philomena remained nearby, a quiet presence in the background, respected but not central. Heloise, a more reserved sister, had long since stepped away from the spiritual world, choosing instead a life of privacy and devotion within the Catholic fold. The last St. John Eve ceremony that Marie Laveau attended took place at Lake Pontchartrain, as it had for many years. By then, Marie II had taken on much of the public leadership. She had organized the event, gathered the followers, and led the rituals. The crowd was larger that year, with people from different parts of the city arriving by boat and carriage. Some came to participate, others came to watch. The ceremony began late in the afternoon. Marie II stood at the center of the gathering, dressed in white, her head wrapped in a turban. She led chants and dances, called on spirits, and offered blessings. The ritual followed familiar patterns. Offerings were placed near the water, songs were sung in Creole, and the crowd moved in rhythms with the drum. As the sun began to set, Marie Laveau appeared. She was older, her movements slower, but her presence was unmistakable. People stepped aside as she walked through the crowd. She didn't speak. She moved towards the edge of the lake, where the water met the sand. Some of the followers called out to her, but she didn't respond. She stepped into the water, walking slowly until it reached her waist. Then she continued forward. The crowd watched in silence. A few people moved towards the shore, unsure of what they were seeing. Marie kept walking until the water covered her shoulders. Then she disappeared beneath the surface. No one saw her return. Some searched the shorelines, others waited through the night. Marie II remained calm, saying nothing to the press or to those who questioned. The next day, the newspapers reported that Marie Laveau had vanished into the lake. Some said it was a final ritual. Others believed she died. No body was recovered. No official statement was made. After the ceremony at Lake Pontchartrain, where Marie Laveau was seen walking into the water and disappearing beneath the surface, confusion spread quickly. Some believed she had died that night, choosing to leave the world in a way that matched her reputation. Others claimed she simply stepped away from public life, retreating into privacy after decades of service. But within weeks, people reported seeing her again. She was spotted near the market on Decatur Street, buying herbs and speaking with vendors. A woman swore she saw Marie outside of the St. Louis Cathedral, her head wrapped in white, praying quietly. A man said she visited his sick wife and left behind a pouch of herbs. These were not vague sightings. They came from people who had known her for years. At the same time, Marie II continued to lead ceremonies. She dressed like her mother, spoke in the same voice, and carried herself with the same calm authority. Some believed she had taken on the role so completely that even longtime followers could no longer tell them apart. Others insisted that the real Marie had never died, that she returned to her home and resumed her work in secret. But city records tell of a different story. Marie Laveau died of natural causes on June 15, 1881, at her home at 152 Rue Sainte-Anne in the French Quarter. She was 79 years old. Her birth date confirmed by baptismal records was September 10, 1801. Her funeral was held the next day at 5 p.m., conducted by Father Hyacinthe Mignoy of St. Louis Cathedral. She was buried in the Gaplin family's crypt at the St. Louis Cemetery, No. 1. Despite these records, confusion persisted. Obituaries published included conflicting details, including one claiming that she was 98 years old and describing her father as a wealthy legislator, an embellishment that is not supported by historical evidence. Her father, Charles Laveau, was involved in real estate and slave trade. If the official timeline is accurate, then the woman seen walking into the lake 16 years later was not Marie I, but her daughter Marie II, reenacting a final ritual to mark the end of her mother's legacy. Marie II had already begun leading public ceremonies for years, including those held at the Bayou St. John. The resemblance between mother and daughter was strong, and the shared name added to the confusion. Some believe the transition was intentional, that Marie and her daughter had planned it carefully, allowing the legend to grow while keeping the truth hidden. Others thought that the stories were a result of fear and admiration, that people wanted to believe she was still alive because the idea of her absence was too unsettling. The line between Marie I and Marie II blurred. Photographs were rare and descriptions varied. Over time, it became difficult to separate fact from rumor. The city accepted both versions. Marie Laveau had died, and she had not. She had walked into the lake, and she had returned. Her presence lingered in the streets, in the rituals, and in the stories told quietly from one generation to the next. Today, nearly a century and a half after her death, Marie Laveau remains one of the most visited figures in New Orleans. Her tomb, located at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, draws thousands of visitors each year. The cemetery itself, established in 1789, is the oldest still operating burial ground in the city, known for its above-ground tombs and tightly packed mausoleums. Marie is believed to be buried in the Gaplin family crypt, though some scholars have questioned whether she lies there or in another nearby vault. The tomb is marked with a plaque bearing her name, and it has become a focal point for spiritual seekers, tourists, and practitioners of voodoo. Visitors come to leave offerings, candles, coins, flowers, beads, and written petitions. Some bring small pouches filled with herbs or personal items, hoping to connect with her spirit. Others mark the term with 3 X's, a practice believed to summon her attention and grant wishes. Preservationists discourage this tradition, noting that it has no basis in voodoo and causes damage to the aging structure. In 2014, the tomb underwent a full restoration after it was vandalized with pink paint, prompting the Archdiocese of New Orleans to restrict access. As of 2015, entry to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is only allowed through guided tours, or for those who with family buried there. Despite these limitations, the pilgrimage continues. Tour guides recount her life and legend, blending fact with folklore. Some visitors come quietly, leaving behind offerings without speaking. Others perform small rituals, lighting candles and whispering prayers. The tomb has become a place of reflection, not just for those seeking spiritual help, but for those drawn to the mystery of her legacy. Marie Laveau's presence is felt not only at her tomb, but through the city. Her name appears in shops, museums, and cultural tours. Her image is printed on candles and charms, sold in the French Quarter. Yet for many, the true connection lies in the quiet moments of the cemetery, where the past and present seem to meet. The offerings left are not just tokens. They are part of an ongoing conversation with a woman whose influence has never truly faded. Marie Laveau's legacy has extended far beyond the streets of New Orleans. In modern culture, she appears in books, films, television, and music, often portrayed as a mystical figure with immense power. One of the most well-known portrayals came in 2013, when Angela Bassett played her in American Horror Story Coven. The figure was fierce, commanding, and immortal, an interpretation that drew from legend more than history. While the show introduced her to a new generation, it also reinforced the image of Marie as a supernatural being rather than a historical woman. It also appeared in Neil Gaiman's American Gods, Marvel Comics, and various novels that blend folklore with fantasy. Her name is invoked in songs, her image printed on candles and charms. These portrayals are often emphasize the mystery and the power, but rarely explore her real-life work as a healer, community leader, and devout Catholic. The tension between her historical identity and her pop culture image is part of what keeps her story alive. Much of the confusion stems from early 20th century writers like Robert Tallant, whose book Voodoo in New Orleans and the Voodoo Queen helped shape the public's understanding of Marie Laveau. Tallant relied heavily on oral tradition and sensationalized accounts, blending fact with fiction in ways that were difficult to untangle. His work influenced generations of writers and filmmakers, many of whom repeated the same embellished stories without verifying their sources. The white press of the 19th century and early 20th century also played a role in shaping her legend. Articles often describe her ceremonies with exoticism, portraying voodoo as dangerous and primitive. These depictions ignore the religious and cultural significance of the practice, reducing it to spectacle. Over time, Marie became a symbol of the other, a figure used to invoke fear, curiosity, and mysticism, depending on the audience. Today, historians and cultural scholars continue to debate which parts of her story are true and which are legend. Her documented acts of charity, healing, and spiritual leadership are often overshadowed by tales of curses, snakes, and supernatural power. Yet, for many in New Orleans, she remained a symbol of resilience, wisdom, and cultural pride. The debate itself has become part of her legacy, a reflection of how history and myth can coexist, especially when the subject is as complex and enduring as Marie Laveau. By the early 20th century, public voodoo gatherings in New Orleans had begun to decline. The vibrant ceremonies once held at Congo Street and Bayou St. John, which had drawn crowds from across the city, became less frequent and eventually faded from public view. Several factors contributed to this shift. One of the major influences was the changing political and social climate. After the Reconstitution, New Orleans saw a rise of Jim Crow laws and increased racial segregation. Restrictions were put in place on when and where Black residents could gather, and public rituals, especially those associated with African-derived religions, were viewed with suspicion by city officials. Voodoo, which once had thrived in the open during the 19th century, was increasingly pushed into private spaces. The Catholic Church also played a role. While Marie Laveau had managed to blend Catholicism with voodoo practices, later religious leaders were less tolerant. Church authorities discouraged rituals and warned parishioners against participating in ceremonies that involved spirit possessions, offerings, and non-Christian prayers. This pressure led many practitioners to keep their beliefs hidden or to shift towards less visible forms of spiritual work, such as hoodoo. By the late 1920s and 1930s, voodoo had largely retreated from the public eye. Ceremonies continued in homes and small gatherings, but the large-scale events that had once defined the practice were rare. Zora Nearly Hurston, an African-American anthropologist and writer, documented some of these traditions during her travel through the Mississippi River Valley in the 1930s. Her work preserved oral histories and rituals that might otherwise have been lost, but she also noted how voodoo had been distorted by sensationalist portrayals in newspapers and pulp fiction. The decline was not a disappearance, though. Elements of voodoo persisted in private practices, passed down through families and small communities. But the era of public queens, open ceremonies, and citywide recognition had ended. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with the rise of cultural tourism and renewed interest in African religions, that voodoo began to re-emerge in public spaces, though often in forms shaped more by commercial appeal than historical continuity. The cottage at 152 Rue St. Anne, where Marie Laveau lived, worked, and raised her family, stood for over a century in the heart of the French Quarter. It was more than a home. It was a place of healing, ritual, and refuge. Journalists who visited during her lifetime describe it as a modest structure with elaborate altars inside filled with candles, herbs, and religious icons. The house belonged to her grandmother, Catherine Henry, who purchased the lot in 1798. After her death, Marie's common-law husband, Christophe Gaplin, acquired the property and deeded it to their children, ensuring the family's continued residence despite the laws prohibiting interracial marriage. For decades after Marie's death, the cottage stood as a quiet landmark, but in 1903, the original structure was torn down. City officials deemed it unfit for habitation, and despite its historical significance, no effort was made to preserve it. A new house was built on the same foundation, and while the architecture changed, the story did not. Visitors continued to report strange occurrences, flickering lights, sudden chills, and the feeling of being watched. Some claimed to see Marie herself walking down St. Anne Street, her figure vanishing before reaching the corner. The removal of the cottage did not erase her presence. If anything, it deepened the mystery. With the physical space gone, what remained was legend. Confusion between Marie I and Marie II, the sightings long after her documented death, and the rituals still performed in her name all contributed to the sense that she never truly left. Her influence persists not just in memory, but in the city's rhythm, in the offerings at her tombs and the stories whispered in courtyards. The quiet belief that somewhere, somehow, she still walks among the living. The story of Marie Laveau doesn't end in her death, nor does it rest entirely with her daughter. The two women, Marie I and Marie II, became so intertwined in life and legend that even now, it is difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. Some say the daughter carried on the work so seamlessly that the city never noticed the transition. Others believe the mother never truly died, that she simply stepped into the shadows while her daughter took the stage. The confusion is part of the magic. It's in the way their names echo through time, in the rituals still following their presence and patterns, in the scent that some say lingers in the air when you walk past St. Anne Street, jasmine and rosewater, soft and sudden, as if someone just walked through. Whether it was Marie I or Marie II who led the final ceremony, whether she walked into the lake or into legend, her presence remains, not just in tombs and stories, but in the quiet corners of the city, in the flicker of a candle, in the hush before a prayer. She is part of the rhythm of New Orleans, guiding steps without being seen, reminding us that magic isn't always loud. It's in the details, the memories, the things we feel but cannot explain. So as you move through your own world this week, let the magic guide your steps. Watch for the flicker of a candle in an empty room, the scent of jasmine and rosewater drift through the air, the feeling that someone or something is gently nudging you forward. These moments may be quiet, but they're never accidental. And these stories never truly end. And that the veil between the past and the present is thinner than we think. Until next week, this is Amanda Joy.